highway through Fukushima Prefecture, and your passenger tells you,
"It's windy today, and radiation from Fukushima Daiichi will be blowing in this direction. The radiation levels are going to rise. We need to turn off the heater and put on our masks."
That's when you know you are in the seat that we all share.
Nuclear hot seat, what are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat, what have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat, the corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat, it's the bomb.
Welcome to Nuclear Hot Seat, the weekly international news magazine keeping you up to date on all things nuclear from a different perspective. My name is Libby Halevi. I am the producer and host, as well as a survivor of the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island from just 1 mile away. So I know what can happen when those nuclear so-called experts get it wrong. This week, we present Nuclear Hot Seat's Voices from Japan, the fifth in our series of interviews on the human impact of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. 4 on-the-ground interviews with Japanese citizens whose lives have been changed forever by the disaster, with context and perspective provided by Beverly Findlay Kaneko, who has produced all 5 Fukushima Anniversary Voices from Japan for Nuclear Hot Seat. Today is Tuesday, March 7, 2017. Beverly Findlay Kaneko has been an educator and journalist who used to live in Japan and now lives in Southern California. Beverly, 6 years have passed since the Fukushima Daiichi accident began. Tell us about the present situation in Japan.
Even now, radiation continues to leak from the crippled plant into the environment. It's leaking both into the air and the ocean, and there really seems to be no end in sight. Even so, the government's nuclear emergency declaration is still in force. The country is under a state of nuclear emergency, or the prefecture of Fukushima.
So they acknowledge the emergency at the same time that they're downplaying it.
Exactly. Places in Fukushima Prefecture that are some distance away from the power plant, like Fukushima City, which is about 40 miles away, places like that give the impression that reconstruction has been successful, at least on the surface. Nobody wears masks anymore. Kids play outdoors. You can buy local produce at the supermarket. It really seems like a normal town. Yuji, my husband, went to Fukushima in February, and he found that the giant bags of decontamination soil that I saw just a couple years ago when I visited in the summer, those had been all around town, and now they're gone. We know that they're not actually gone. They've actually been removed to less obvious locations. When I was there in the summer a couple years ago, there was an abandoned park, nature park, that was really a whole mountain, and I could see where they were raising the trees off the mountainside and terracing and starting to stack the bags there in this nature park that people don't use anymore. So I'm assuming that the bags have been tucked away in interim/permanent places like that. In other parts of Japan, even now during the 3/11 season, there isn't a single book about nuclear power displayed at the bookstores. In the couple of years after the accident, there were big displays of books about nuclear, but those are a thing of the past. It's like the whole thing has become ancient history already.
That's really hard to imagine, especially considering the fact that for those of us who are outside the country, we know about the ongoing nature and the fact that this has not gone away. Why do you think it has become so hushed up in Japan?
Well, there's nothing sensational like a radioactive plume floating over Tokyo to catch people's imaginations. Really, to the media, Fukushima has become a dull subject. But this doesn't mean that Fukushima Daiichi has stopped leaking, and it doesn't mean that radiation isn't harmful anymore. That's the problem. The situation itself hasn't changed for 6 years, but it's just not topical anymore in the media's point of view.
They do have a really short attention span, and it sounds like the media has stopped covering Fukushima in Japan, and for that reason people have stopped paying attention to it.
Yes, that's true, and it makes for a very comfortable situation for the government and for TEPCO that nobody is taking a real critical look at the situation now. It relieves them of any responsibility to be transparent about what's going on, and it also helps to absolve them of legal responsibility. TEPCO has even argued in lawsuits that radiation spread on its own accord, so it's not their responsibility. It's as if they're not culpable for the accident. The government allows TEPCO to ignore victims and continue raking in their profits. Before, the government shut down all the nuclear power plants across Japan because of the feeling that they were dangerous. Now it wants to restart them. It's really upsetting that they're even talking about not decommissioning Fukushima Dai-2 or number 2 nuclear power plant. They're talking about restarting it again someday. The central government actually is ignoring the wishes of the Fukushima Prefectural government, which voted for decommissioning all nuclear reactors in the prefecture.
This is incredibly painful to hear. It's like no one is listening to the wishes and needs of those who are still most affected by the nuclear disaster.
Yes, and that's why today we want to give voice to the victims of the accident who have been all but ignored by the media.
Before we move into the interviews, give us some background on the current situation to help us understand what's going on.
Well, I think this year the most important thing that we need to talk about, and what all of our interviews are based around, is the fact that the government is lifting the evacuation orders at the end of the month for all areas except those that are really extremely contaminated, those places that are right adjacent to the nuclear power plant. After 6 years, the government is finally giving people the green light to return to their hometowns.
While some might interpret this as good news, it's really not.
Absolutely. It's wonderful news for those people that want to return home. You know, some elderly people who really want to get back and stay in their homes and honor their ancestors. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who don't want to go back. In fact, more people don't want to return than those that do. And for them, lifting the evacuation orders is really bad news.
Share with us a bit more as to why that's the case.
It's true that radiation levels have gone down both due to the natural decay cycle and decontamination, but the levels are still very high. Compared to before the accident, there are many places where the radiation levels are what used to be considered too dangerous for habitation. Fukushima has many forests and mountains, and those areas are really impossible to decontaminate, so people can't enter those areas. When I visited Fukushima 2 years ago in the summer, we went around carrying Geiger counters, and when we were on streets and city roads that had been cleaned up, we were fine. But the minute we stepped off of those roads and kind of started climbing up a grassy hillside into a park that had a lot of trees, the Geiger counters started going off because those areas, they don't even try to decontaminate them. It's impossible. We read in the Mainichi Shimbun that more than 30 million people have worked on the decontamination effort, and that sounds like a crazy number of people, and certainly there are a lot of people that have been working on it up until this point, but we think that the number could apply to one person working on more than one or perhaps several jobs, because the people are hired kind of as day laborers or contract laborers, so there could be double counting of people in that. Nevertheless, it's a huge number. And another huge number we have to look at is the 2.6 trillion yen that has been spent on trying to clean things up. That's $23 billion. It's been used to try and clean up 111 villages, towns, and cities in 8 different prefectures, not just Fukushima. And they still can't bring down the contamination levels far enough. So, the government has decided to let people return to areas where radiation levels are 20 times what the standard permissible level was before the accident. This is the 20 millisievert annual exposure level that was previously okay for emergency situations. Other places in Japan still fall under the previous standard of 1 millisievert per year. So the government is ignoring the law and saying that, well, it's been decontaminated and a little leftover radiation is okay. You can't run away from it forever, so go home. That's how they decided to lift the evacuation order.
Of course, when we say decontamination, that's a false concept when it comes to radiation, because even the smallest amount of radiation is just as deadly to human cells, to human bodies, to our DNA. You can't really decontaminate. What they're doing is they're dispersing it, but it never gets weaker. It just becomes smaller and smaller and spreads and distributes greater distances from the original source. That ignores the science, the hard science, that there is no such thing as a safe dose of radiation, that underneath a particular level you're fine. It all counts, it's all dangerous, and it is cumulative in the body. So the fact that they are playing games with the numbers makes no difference in how this is going to be affecting people and their DNA and their health and the health of future generations. What actions are being taken by those people who have been most profoundly affected?
The town of Minamisoma is suing the government, demanding that the 20 millisievert standard for returning to Fukushima be revoked. They are arguing that the standard should be backed by both scientific and legal reasoning. Our last interview today is with Mr. Yuki Saito. He's one of the attorneys involved with this trial. Of course, money's at the root of all of this. If people are no longer classified as evacuees, their compensation can be cut.
And, of course, the government and TEPCO don't want to keep footing the bill for compensation, do they?
No, they don't. After the accident, the government has been providing evacuees with money for housing and other support. It was really the bare minimum for people forced out of their homes who had lost their assets and their jobs. But even this support is going to be cut. There are many people who don't want to return to areas that are still radioactive, but will have no other choice because they're losing support. There are people that are continuing to protest, but the government is not listening and is effectively forcing them to return home.
That brings us to our first voice from Japan, Setsuko Kida, who has been on Nuclear Hot Seat twice in the past. She is from Tomioka, which is just 10 kilometers, or about 5 miles, from Fukushima Daiichi. She continues to be active in the anti-nuclear movement, and what follows is testimony she gave during a trial in January that sought to prevent the restart of a nuclear reactor in another part of Japan. Setsuko Kida.
2011年に発生した原発事故による被災地。
It has been nearly 6 years since the horrible East Japan earthquake. Every year when March rolls around, TV and the newspapers have special features with titles like "We Will Never Forget That Day" and "The Disaster Zone Today." But in the past couple of years, the focus has shifted to reconstruction, businesses starting over, and farmers struggling with so-called harmful rumors. On the other hand, the media pays very little attention to radioactive contamination or children with thyroid cancer and other health problems. I'd like to talk about the issues in Fukushima today that tend to get drowned out by the drum roll of reconstruction. The number of people who left Fukushima in the wake of the nuclear disaster still stands at 89,000. The peak was in 2012, when 165,000 people had left the prefecture. About 70,000 have returned. This year, at the end of March, housing stipends for people who evacuated will be halted. So the number of returnees will probably increase because people will have no other choice. This will force senior citizens on fixed incomes who can't pay the monthly rent for public housing, and others with limited funds to live in their earthquake-damaged homes that they can't afford to repair. There will probably be many people that will have to turn to decontamination work to make ends meet. The government has divided the evacuation zones into 3 classifications: the difficult-to-return zone, the restricted residence zone, and the evacuation order cancellation preparation zone. There are areas where it is permitted to return and those that are not. These zones are not decided by contamination level, but rather they are based on dividing lines between towns and villages. Your neighbor's home across the street could still be in the evacuation zone, while yours is supposedly ready for you to move back. Households that are designated for evacuation receive living costs and other compensation. Households that don't receive that designation receive very little. The people that didn't receive very much money naturally feel animosity towards those that were able to evacuate. In this way, the community has become divided. Last year, a young couple that returned to Fukushima to farm committed suicide. The strawberries that they worked so hard to grow were left unsold at market because produce from outside of Fukushima always sells out first. It's said that the reason they killed themselves is that they were so devastated by the low price their strawberries fetched at market. Also, in areas around the nuclear power plant, the number of elderly people dying of loneliness is increasing. This is because their children and grandchildren, who lived with them before the accident, have left the prefecture. They are dying of heart attacks and strokes. Sudden deaths like these are increasing among those in their 60s. And pediatric thyroid cancer is on the rise too. As of December 2016, there were 183 confirmed and suspected cases. Typically, thyroid cancer among children is around 1 or 2 cases per 1 million population. At the time of the nuclear accident, Fukushima's under 18 population was only 370,000, so 183 cases is abnormally high. Even so, the government refuses to admit a link with the nuclear accident. Since the year of the disaster, Fukushima Prefecture has been conducting medical screenings, such as thyroid cancer screening and whole-body counter scans. Fukushima Prefecture will pay for treatment and ongoing care for those in need, but they make victims sign a non-disclosure agreement in the case of metastases and recurrence. This could be why there is not much information about types of treatment used. Parents probably go ahead and sign the non-disclosure agreement because of the burden of medical costs and because they are thinking of their children's futures. Actually, thyroid cancer is on the rise among adults too. There was a case where someone who had undergone and passed the prefecture's screening still felt funny and decided to be screened by a third-party hospital. Tests found that cancer had spread to the backside of the patient's lungs. Before I became a nuclear refugee, I lived in a nuclear town and never dreamed that nuclear power plants were so fragile that they could cause such a severe accident. I was out of town on business when the accident happened, but watching the explosion on TV was a jolt of reality. And after the accident, I never dreamed that I would be living as an evacuee after 6 years. Even after seeing all of the illnesses and the whole entire county of Futaba, in the vicinity of the power plant having to evacuate, I still believed that the government wouldn't just throw away the people of Fukushima. I thought TEPCO would take responsibility and compensate people. But now, Japan has already forgotten the lessons of Fukushima. It is trying to restart the nuclear power plants that were shut down in the wake of the accident. But now, Japan has already forgotten the lessons of Fukushima. It is trying to restart the nuclear power plants that were shut down in the wake of the accident. And the government protects TEPCO while it fails to look out for the rights and lives of Fukushima citizens and their children.
That was Setsuko Kida. Beverly, you shared with me one of the most horrifying stories that I have heard about what Japan is doing to ignore and try and convince people that everything is still normal. Explain what you learned about the drive up in Fukushima Prefecture.
In February, Yuji visited Fukushima with Kida-san. That was the second time he's actually been to her home. And she drove him to Tomioka. They took the Joban Highway, which runs from Hirono to Minami-Soma. That highway actually was closed for quite a while, and it has been reopened in the recent past. It's also known as the radioactive highway because people driving through there get exposed to radiation.
Now, this is a known fact that, oh, well, we'll take the drive, we'll see the sights, and we'll get exposed to radiation?
Well, I suppose so, but I think a lot of people maybe don't think about it. Let me give you a few more details. The highway runs as close as 5 kilometers or 3 miles from Fukushima Daiichi. In the stretch from Tomioka Interchange to Namie Interchange, about 13 kilometers or 8 miles is in the difficult to return zone. That is the most radioactive zone. And Kida-san mentioned that in her testimony. And about 9 kilometers or 5.5 miles is in the restricted residence zone. That's the zone where people can go to their homes, but they're not allowed to stay overnight. On the highway, there are 9 radiation monitoring posts. Yuji said that as they drove through this stretch, Kida-san said, "It's windy today, and radiation from Fukushima Daiichi will be blowing in this direction. The radiation levels are going to rise. We need to turn off the heater," and remember, this is winter. She said, "We need to turn off the heater and put on our masks." And he said that sure enough, as they got closer to Tomioka, the monitoring post showed a higher level. He showed me a picture, and the level was 1.5 microsieverts per hour, which is about 7 times the quote-unquote decontaminated level that was being sought by the government.
Oh, my God.
And that's along a cleaned-up section of highway.
We'll put cleaned up in quotes for that.
Yes, quote-unquote cleaned up. Japan's Highway Management Organization, which is called NEXCO, their website gives hourly updates on the radiation levels, much like a weather report. It also has updates on how much actual exposure one would get going through certain areas. On the day that Yuji and Kida-san drove through the area, the website said, "Drivers passing through this area today at 70 kilometers per hour can expect 0.2 microsieverts of exposure. This is a low level, so there is nothing to worry about."
Excuse me while I make a choking noise.
And they are so very kind to let us know how much radiation the people working at toll booths are exposed to. I really don't get this, why there are people even working at toll booths in that area. Japan is so technologically advanced, and in many parts of Japan, there aren't even people at the toll booths. Why can't they have unmanned toll booths in this area? It is beyond me. I just don't understand. Anyway, workers apparently can expect an additional millisievert of annual exposure from working in a toll booth on the radioactive highway. So mind you, that puts them at 2 times what was originally the acceptable level of exposure annually.
Well, this is, of course, unacceptable. It's actually insane. And yet, the people living there are forced to deal with this exposure. There must be people who end up on this road without even really thinking about it. What if there are babies on board? What if there's a traffic jam or an accident or your car breaks down and you're stuck there for some period of time? Does the website say anything about those sorts of things?
No, and there aren't any warnings when you enter the highway. I can't believe that they're forcing people back into an area like this.
Neither can I. Let's get to the next of our Voices from Japan. It is an interview with professional photographer Shinshu Hida. He is from Miharu town in Fukushima. Miharu is 50 kilometers or about 30 miles from Fukushima Daiichi. It is contaminated, but it was never designated as an evacuation zone. Hida-san is known for his photos of Japanese craftsmen, but since the accident, he has turned his lens on the devastated landscape of Fukushima. He has 3 goals for his photographs: for people not to forget about the accident, to show the aftermath exactly how it was, and to promote understanding of the feelings of Fukushima's people. Here's Shinshu Hida. Hida-san, as a photographer, you have been documenting the areas affected by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident since the beginning. How do you feel things have changed over the past 6 years?
The level of radioactivity is definitely going down bit by bit, but the soil is still extremely contaminated in tens and hundreds of thousands of becquerels. Buildings are deteriorating, and animals have taken up residence inside, and looters have stolen what they can. I've been taking pictures since the accident and feel that it is important to be able to show young people what has happened.
While you were out on photo shoots, what has made the biggest impression on you?
The insides of houses are exactly as they were left when people fled in March 2011. It's as if time has stopped. But things have rotted and corroded. Animals have made these homes into their nests. When I enter the empty houses by myself, it feels like a cruel mistake that they were abandoned. This is a fault of the nuclear power plant, and I have a deep conviction that we have to strongly protest against what has happened.
At the end of this March, the evacuation orders are going to be lifted, and the government is telling people who live in areas that are 20 millisieverts or less to go home. How do you feel about that?
At the end of last year, I went to France and spoke about that with some scientists there. They told me that even after 30 years, the evacuation zone around Chernobyl is still off limits, even though the radiation level in the air is just 0.07 microsieverts. They said that it was unthinkable to be making people return to the evacuation zones in Fukushima, where even after decontamination, the radiation level is 3 microsieverts in places. I think it is cruel to make people return to an area where an annual dose is as much as 20 millisieverts. Why is this standard only in Fukushima? The standard for other places in Japan is 1 or 2 millisieverts a year. They are treating us like guinea pigs. I think they are also preparing a 20 millisievert framework for future accidents. This way, they have the precedent of people in Fukushima living under the 20 millisievert standard. So they won't have to evacuate or compensate people affected by future accidents.
I've heard that you are working with the families affected by thyroid cancer. Can you tell us about this?
Right now, there are 184 thyroid cancer cases among children from 0 to 18 years old. The IAEA WHO, Fukushima Prefecture, and Fukushima Prefectural Medical University all assert that there is no correlation between the nuclear accident and these cases of thyroid cancer. I don't understand how they can say this when before the accident there were only about 1 to 3 cases per 1 million. When the number has gone up so dramatically, why won't they admit that there is a link? I strongly believe that it is because of the nuclear accident. It's really strange that they refuse to see that it is connected when there are more than 100 cases. Other than the doctors that are in cahoots with the government and support that opinion, there are quite a few physicians that have come out to say that denying the relationship is odd. Unfortunately, the government chooses not to listen to them. The government's method is undemocratic and coercive. This makes me extremely angry. This is why I have been trying to gather information and prove that the government's opinion is wrong.
That was photographer Shinshu Hida. Hida-san mentioned childhood thyroid cancer in the interview. Elaborate on this for us.
One of the reasons evacuees, especially families with children, are hesitant to return to Fukushima is health problems, and cancer in particular. In 2015, Fukushima Prefecture conducted a survey as a part of its health screenings. It found that 94.4% of people were uneasy about radiation. 69.5% were worried about their children's health. 50.6% were concerned about food safety. 43.2% worried about safe drinking water. 39.5% worried about children playing outdoors. And 35% were concerned about genetic defects.
I'm not surprised that there were levels of concern for all of these, though it shocks me a little as to the decreasing amount of concern for food safety and drinking water and the genetic effects. It's clear that the number of people concerned about their children's health is very high. And I guess it's only natural to worry about the effects of radiation on health when the decontamination efforts have been such a failure.
Yes, the thyroid cancer problem is especially acute. The National Cancer Center's statistics show that in 2010, there were only 2 cases of pediatric thyroid cancer in Fukushima. Now the figure is 184.
You know, in journalism, they always caution us that proximity is not necessarily causality. However, if you look at the linkage between these numbers to draw an obvious conclusion, the increase in the thyroid cancer rates is due to radiation exposure.
Well, the Fukushima Prefecture Committee responsible for thyroid screening reasons that children in Fukushima were exposed to far less radiation than those in Chernobyl. But they are only looking for the statistics for Belarus, where the radiation levels were highest. In areas like southern Kaluga state, the exposure levels were lower and children still got thyroid cancer. The Japanese government is conveniently omitting these statistics. Another place they're cherry-picking the numbers is with the age at the time of illness. In Fukushima, a large percentage of children 15 years and older at the time of the accident are getting cancer. Fukushima Prefecture argues that the Chernobyl statistics show that younger children were getting sick. Therefore, the Chernobyl case is irrelevant once again. But it turns out that older children did get thyroid cancer in Chernobyl, and that Fukushima Prefecture just disregarded those statistics. Dr. Suzuki of Fukushima Prefectural Medical University says that 72 out of 96 cases of thyroid cancer in the children had metastasized. Their excuse is that more cases of thyroid cancers were found because of a quote-unquote screening effect or overdiagnosis don't seem to explain the serious nature of the cancers that were found. Furthermore, there's data showing more cases of thyroid cancer in the prefecture surrounding Fukushima too. But the government asserts that because the amount of radiation wasn't as high as in Fukushima, that screening in those areas wasn't necessary.
This is the nuclear equivalent of cooking the books to try and suppress or depress the number of cases that are being recorded and the full impact of what this disaster has been doing and continues to do. So it's not that radiation isn't high. It's that the screening committee simply doesn't want to admit a link with the accident.
It would seem that way, wouldn't it? After his interview, Hida-san said to Yuji, before the accident, it was the nuclear energy is safe myth. No matter what happened, the government and the utility companies insisted that nuclear was safe. Since the accident, they've been doing the same thing. Now it's the radiation is safe myth. Have you ever heard of such a stupid country?
Well, the United States has its own areas of stupid, but we will leave that for another time. Let's move on to the next interview. It's with Noriko Matsumoto, who is a voluntary, put that in quotes, evacuee from Koriyama, who lives in Kawasaki near Tokyo now. Is there anything we should know before we listen to what she has to say?
I think we need to talk a little bit about the definition of categories of evacuees. And among evacuees, there are what is called, quote-unquote, voluntary evacuees. These are people from areas that were not in the official evacuation zones that were contaminated to a certain degree. There are many areas like this, such as big cities like Fukushima and Koriyama. Depending on the area, the government has provided some assistance with rental housing in other parts of Japan. The phrase voluntary evacuee is misleading, partially because it puts the onus on evacuating on the victim. It makes it sound like they made an arbitrary decision to move on their own accord. But these people have reasons to move, and they have a right to move. Technically, they should be called evacuees from outside the official evacuation zone, rather than the ambiguous voluntary evacuees. These people have been facing a whole different set of challenges, as Matsumoto-san explains.
避難の共同センターについてお話を伺いたいと思います。
I'd like to ask you about the Cooperation Center for 311. First, why was the center necessary in the first place?
お話を伺いたいと思います。
はい。ですね、去年
2 years ago, the government announced that assistance for evacuees would be terminated in March of 2017. We negotiated with the government and Fukushima Prefecture, but we realized that Fukushima Prefecture was not going to budge on their decision. There was an opinion survey of people who left from areas not designated as evacuation zones. 70% answered that they would be unable to return to their homes. We wondered what people who were not returning were going to do come April if their assistance was halted in March. As we negotiated with various groups that would be providing assistance, we realized that it would be important to include evacuees in the discussions. That's how we came together and formed the Cooperation Center for 311.
If government assistance had been sufficient, there wouldn't have been a need for the center, right?
I don't think the government recognizes the extent of the problems caused by the nuclear accident. Of course, many people lost their lives in a tsunami and earthquake. But due to the radioactivity in a 40-kilometer zone, there are people who could have been rescued that were left to die. and Fukushima Prefecture's awareness of its task to protect its citizens have morphed into reconstruction. They are throwing away those of us who moved away from areas that are not officially in the evacuation zone. We are refugees in our own country. There are many senior citizens who left Fukushima, but most were families with children who left to protect them from radiation exposure. We've been trying to work with aid organizations to help, since we can't expect any assistance from our government.
Fukushima evacuees are spread across Japan. I've heard that things are not always easy, and that people have faced many hardships. I've also heard that there is conflict among evacuees.
I've heard about that too. I personally haven't had any disagreements though. Problems are especially prevalent among people who have settled in the Tokyo area. This is because they've been housed in national civil servant housing and local public housing. There are divisions between people from within and outside of the official evacuation zones in Fukushima who have been housed together. And then there are Tokyo citizens who want to live in public housing and wonder why people from Fukushima are giving priority. Complicated problems like this are common in Tokyo. In Kanagawa Prefecture, just south of Tokyo, most evacuees have rented private apartments, so they are all scattered. They have to visit real estate offices and rent apartments under the government program, and they are not all grouped together in one public building. Since they are isolated, they have problems making connections.
Recently, there was an incident of bullying in Yokohama that was in the news. Are there widespread problems with children and adults being accepted in the communities where they've settled? Have you personally had any issues?
In my case, we evacuated just when my daughter was graduating from elementary school and entering junior high school. My daughter had some physical problems after the accident, like nosebleeds and diarrhea. I heard that she had some troubles in junior high school after the fact. When kids have reached junior high, they are starting to act like grown-ups, and they don't want to cause extra worry to their mothers. And then, knowing she felt this way, it made it hard for me to ask her if anything was wrong. It was a difficult situation. The Yokohama case was caused by ignorance about the situation of Fukushima evacuees. There was the impression that the family was receiving government assistance, when in fact they were not getting any help to rent their apartment. Kids absorb what their parents are talking about at home and take it out on their classmates at school. And then the parents of the bullied child become upset. It's a terrible feeling to know that choosing to evacuate has caused an extra level of suffering for our children. It makes it even more difficult to be open about the fact that we have evacuated. Moms, even those with small children, can't even be open about the fact that we have left for a just cause, to protect our kids from radiation. We are prevented from raising our voices. It's very complicated.
You mentioned misunderstandings about compensation being a problem. Do people outside of Fukushima think that everyone from there is profiting from government assistance?
Yes, you're right. In particular, people don't understand about radiation exposure. They don't realize that there are different classifications based on the evacuation zones stipulated by the government. And they don't know that Fukushima is a really big place. For some reason, the only thing that gets attention is compensation.
So proper information hasn't really made it around the country, has it? Do you think the media is responsible?
Yes, I think this is the biggest reason. Even with this bullying case in Yokohama, the media didn't focus on the fact that it was caused by ignorance due to the lack of good information about the evacuee situation.
It sounds like the media needs to do a better job covering this story.
I think the media knows what is going on from many different perspectives. I just wish that they would be straight with us and communicate the truth.
That was Noriko Matsumoto. What Matsumoto-san shared about bullying is really painful to hear.
Yes, it is. There are lots of stories about people becoming afraid to go out after they've been shunted from place to place like refugees. Then they have trouble fitting in where they end up, and sometimes they're even seen as bad people. The stigma of being a Fukushima evacuee drives them into the closet. They may need help for their children who are hurting, but they themselves are unsure whether it's safe to get close to people, and they don't want to be a bother with their problems. It becomes a downward spiral into self-doubt, depression, and paranoia.
It's terrible that people who have been through so much are then stigmatized just because they are from Fukushima. It sounds like there needs to be more of a support network for Fukushima evacuees in their new communities.
Yes, and I think that's what Matsumoto-san's group is trying to do. They can't really rely on the government to provide this network, so that's what they are doing. They're networking between themselves and also with the non-governmental, nonprofit organizations that have sprouted up to help people across Japan who have evacuated from Fukushima. There are people out there that help, and I just give a little aside here. I'm a member of the Association of Foreign Wives of Japanese, and in June is our convention, and at every convention we take donations from some sort of charity, and I found out that one of the groups that we're taking donations for this year is a group that accepts children to come for relaxation and recuperation on the island of Shikoku, which is where we're actually having our convention. So I think across Japan there are these little groups, these people, these kind people that have reached out to help the victims of Fukushima.
There are also a number of lawsuits that are taking place, and our last interview is with Yuki Saito, an attorney working on Minamisoma's Revoke the 20 millisievert standard lawsuit. Give us a little bit of background on that.
Minamisoma is about 15 miles away from Fukushima Daiichi. There are places in that town that are much more contaminated than other places, especially, as we mentioned before, the mountainous areas. The plaintiffs in the lawsuit are from the mountainous area in Minamisoma. I need to explain the official designation, specific spot recommended for evacuation. This is used when an area has certain hot spots that are above a 20 millisievert annual dose. Those places are singled out for extra compensation that may not be in line with the rest of the area. And you'll hear more about that in Mr. Saito's interview, and I think Kida-san also alluded to neighbors having different levels of compensation. You're always kind of second-guessing your neighbor. How much money did they get? What level of contamination does their home have? People really don't know. I mentioned earlier that evacuation orders are going to be lifted for all of Fukushima except for the very most contaminated zones at the end of March. Minamisoma actually had its evacuation order lifted and compensation canceled in December of 2014. Before this happened, there was quite a bit of opposition from the residents of Minamisoma. At the public meeting prior to the change of zone status People complained that strontium and plutonium are still in the environment, and no matter how much you decontaminate, radiation will still come down from the mountains and the forests. The radiation levels inside our homes is still very high. We can't let our children live here. Of course, the government ignored their voices. It was decided that health problems can't be linked to doses under 20 millisieverts annually, so the designation was still going to be changed. However, until now, Japanese law has followed ICRP guidelines limiting annual doses to 1 millisievert. Even X-ray technicians' quarterly dose is set at 1.3 millisieverts. It's only natural to doubt the reasoning behind allowing 20 millisieverts for areas to have evacuation orders lifted. And that's why Minamisoma citizens are suing the government.
Let's hear from Yuki Saito.
基準値いろいろな20ミリシーベルトとか1ミリシーベルトとか空間線
There are many standards for measuring radiation doses. 20 millisieverts, 1 millisievert, standards for air contamination and for soil contamination. And there is much discussion about what official levels should be set. Do you think the emergency guidelines of other countries will be referenced in this trial?
海外の基準値を参考にするということはありますか？
When we are discussing standards during this trial, we will first highlight what Japanese law has indicated up until this point. As far as foreign standards of radiation dose are concerned, we will note the ICRP guidelines, and we will see how these are reflected in Japanese law until now. So we will be looking at the international standards. When it comes to nuclear power, it's not a problem that we can examine by looking at Japan alone. There's not very much Japanese data regarding accidents, so we have to look at data and research from other places, such as Chernobyl.
On President Obama's last day in office, his administration formally adopted new Protective Action Guidelines, or PAGs, that dramatically raised permissible levels of exposure after an accident. The annual dose was upped to 20 millisieverts, and drinking water limits were raised from 1,000 to 10,000 times what they were previously. There was a lot of opposition from environmental groups. What do you think about this?
If foreign standards like that are going to be alluded to during the trial, that could be detrimental to our case. More than the standards themselves, though, the reasoning behind them is important. We have to be cautious about the Japanese-American relationship. And we need to make sure that the fact that an accident occurred here in Japan is not used in a bad way. I'm concerned that the guideline levels in the US may have been raised because there was an accident here in Japan, and it has been seen that radiation levels aren't going down, and lower contamination levels can't be reached. They may want to prevent an inconvenient situation if there is an accident in the future. I think because we have experienced an accident here in Japan, we need to be extra careful that our situation does not become a precedent toward loosening safety guidelines. This lawsuit is an example of what I'm talking about. The people of Minamisoma, of course, think that the 20 millisievert standard is wrong because they live there. But they're also thinking about their kids and grandkids. It's not just a problem of the present. If the people of Minamisoma back down and say that 20 millisieverts is okay, it will not only affect them. It can be used as a precedent for new, higher acceptable levels, which will in turn allow the lifting of evacuation orders for areas that are still heavily contaminated. That's why the people of Minamisoma stood up. It's not just for themselves. It's to help other areas too. I'm really hoping we can do something about this.
I've heard a lot about communities becoming divided over issues like evacuation and compensation. Has that been your experience?
Yes, there are a lot of problems with division. More than community to community, it is really household to household. One household might be designated as contaminated and receive compensation, but the next door neighbors, who could be relatives, may not be compensated. Radioactive contamination standards are applied unevenly too. If a pregnant mother or children are living in a household, that household has a stricter standard applied to it. So situations are not uncommon where neighbors' homes are equally contaminated. But one neighbor has kids, so they qualify for compensation. But the other neighbor doesn't have children, so they don't. In the past, people in Minamisoma got along well together, having barbecues, drinking parties, and other get-togethers. Many people have complained that the uneven application of contamination standards and unfair distribution of compensation has led to breakdown of their community. This has caused a lot of distress. Our lawsuit to abolish the 20 millisievert standard has been an opportunity for people to overcome the division and work together on an issue that affects all of them, regardless of how they have been classified by the government so far.
That was attorney Yuki Saito.
We've been talking about what the reality is on the ground for the people of Fukushima whose lives have been so devastated by this disaster. What final thoughts would you like to leave us with today?
First of all, on behalf of the team that's been working on Voices from Japan for the past few years, that would be me and my husband and all of the voiceover artists that have helped out, we would really like to thank you, Libby, and your listeners for taking the time to look past the headlines for a deeper view of what is going on, not just in nuclear Japan, but the rest of the world. We hope that this year's installment of the special edition of Nuclear Hot Seat has put a human face on the consequences of governments and the nuclear industry's greed, incompetence, and cynicism. The nuclear industry in cahoots with government has torn apart communities, not just because of accidents or slipshod work, but also in their ongoing disregard for human rights and policies that are supposedly meant to help people, but instead cause further division and heartbreak. I'm encouraged by the heroes we interviewed this time. All of them may have lost their communities, but they have shown the strength to go out and create new communities. And I really admire all of them.
Thank you, Beverly, for your efforts in putting together this special edition of Nuclear Hot Seat, Voices from Japan, Fukushima at Year 6. This has been Nuclear Hot Seat for Tuesday, March 7, 2017. Voices from Japan, Fukushima at 6 was guest produced by Beverly Finlay Kaneko, with our deepest gratitude. Japanese interviews were conducted by Yu-Ji Kaneko. Many thanks to our voiceover talent. Setsuko Kida was voiced by Chihiro Kei, Shinshu Hida by Yoshi Ando, Noriko Matsumoto by Sachio Kei, and Yuki Saito by Hiru Matsunaga. If you have a story lead, a hot tip, or a suggestion of someone to interview, send an email to info@nuclearhotseat.com. We are copyright 2017, Libby Halevi and Heartistry Communications. All rights reserved, but fair use allowed as long as proper attribution is provided. This is Libby Halevi of Heartistry Communications, the heart of the art of communicating, reminding you that the Fukushima nuclear disaster is ongoing and will never go away. That's your nuclear wake-up call. Now, don't go back to sleep, and let's all get active, because we are all in the nuclear hot seat.
Nuclear hot seat, what are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat, what have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat, the corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat, it's the bomb.
skateboard